Okay. All right, we're walking across the street. I'm recording. Where are we?
This is Innenstraße 22. It's in the suburbs of Berlin, in Dahlem. And this building we're standing outside was the former Kaiser-Wilhelm-Institute.
Why did you drive us to this building?
Well, we've read so much about it that I wanted to see it for myself. Just outside the main entrance here, you see the giant bronze head of Pallas Athena, who's the god of arts and scientists. That was like the emblem for the society that set up this scientific institute in 1927. On the east side, that was like the director's offices. And then the Eugenics department had their offices with the laboratories on the first floor. And in the attic you had the skull collections.
And how far away are we here from where all those bodies were found? Welcome to Dig Where You Stand. I'm Ben Schumann-Stoller from Cola Media.
I'm Peter Matthews, a writer at the Berliner magazine.
This is episode 3, our final planned episode in season 1.
Across all 3 episodes, we've been talking about how these human remains kind of keep turning up and what to do with these different kind of incidents of them. But in this episode, we're going to look at one of the most recent significant finds of human remains. So this was actually found in 2014 and finally laid to rest only last year in March of 2023.
If the first episode was asking, why are these ancestors, these human remains here in Berlin? And the second episode looked at, why can't we just give them back? In this one, we're examining a complex case that makes you wonder what's going to happen to all of them, or how should we respond to the buried crimes that they represent. In 2014, on the grounds of the Free University, you'd say in English, Freie Universität, you'd say in German, which is in Dahlem, in the area of Berlin in the southwest where the former American sector was, human bones were discovered.
We spoke with the archaeologist who did the provenance research on this project, a woman called Susan Pollock.
So I'm an archaeologist. I was a professor here in this institute where we're sitting until my retirement a couple of years ago. But I also do an archaeology of modern times, pretty much the 20th century, and have worked at various places in and around Berlin. So in 2014, on the 1st of July, there was repair work that was being done to lay new water pipes, new sewage pipes near the university library. And so they had a backhoe there that dug a long trench. And as they were nearing the end of the trench, the backhoe cut through a pit, that is a cut in the ground that was full of bones. And they were able to recognize that these were also human bones.
Peter, you think you'd be able to recognize a human bone if you saw one in the playground or something?
I mean, a skull, a rib cage maybe would stand out, but I wonder how quickly they realized what they were dealing with. I mean, I'm not sure you would recognize a shin bone.
I might just be like, oh, they're animal bones.
But we're talking about quite a lot. There were several pits sort of brimming with bones, so I imagine it would have made quite a stark impression. And
what would you do if you came across some bones that you thought were a human?
Well, I think I'll do what they did, which is they called the police.
And so at that point, the university was notified that something had happened. The police was notified, and the police came as well as somebody from the coroner's office and collected what they could see, took it off, and analyzed it in the city coroner's office. So, as I said, they were taken to the city coroner's office, and they were very briefly examined in the matter of a few days. And some very basic information was collected on them. And the major issue for them was, were these the remains of a very recent crime? So did something happen 2 years before that needed to be looked at judicially? And they concluded that that was not the case.
They were looking for a crime at first. And then I think that they quickly realized, these are probably too old. Also, there's too many of them. We would have heard about it.
I mean, you would hope we would have heard about, if it was some kind of recent mass murder or...
Yeah, I mean, they were the remains of a crime, I suppose.
Right, but these weren't buried. I mean, you would know if you saw sort of neat rows of human skeletons.
Right, these were human remains that were packed together. So they weren't laid in discrete graves or something. They were sort of filled in a pit.
Disposed of, is
right.
how Susan Pollock told us.
And I think that there was also evidence, I mean, we'll come into this later, but that the pits had been dug quickly. They seem to have been made in a hurry.
And I would guess a listener hearing about this for the first time is wondering why so many bones would need to be quickly disposed of in Berlin. They found these bones.
Right.
Media gets word of it, and then what happens?
And quickly, I mean, I think there's some newspaper articles that come out pretty soon afterwards. And, you know, it's not a secret. Quite quickly, people realize that this site where these things are found has a very dark history.
So what does the university do? Do they do a big investigation? Here's Pollock again.
There was then apparently some back and forth between the university and them, which nobody really wants to say what happened. But the long and the short of it was that in December, they were turned over to the crematorium in Ruhleben and cremated and buried anonymously.
Yeah, they're cremated. The German word eingeäschert, like from being turned into ashes, äschert.
Right. But remember, I mean, that's 6 months later. So the workers find these pits. They find them on July 1st. And the crematorium, the municipal crematorium, the city burns them in December. So there's 6 months. That's a long opportunity to look deeper and see what this stuff is. And some sort of accusations after that start going around in the press that, you know, you didn't look at this. This is an important thing. You've let this stuff get burned because you didn't want to deal with it.
You're right. The main accusation was that the university officials, maybe even also the city, knew what these remains could be and made an intentional choice, did not want to look deeper, did not want to know for sure where these human bones could be from.
There have been allegations on both sides that the other side didn't communicate enough and so on. From the side of the coroner's office, they say that human remains are found in Berlin more or less every day. And if somebody does not come to claim them or say, okay, this is clearly the following people and they have the following relatives and whatever, this is their so-called standard procedure.
So 7 sacks, I think it was, you know, like 250 liters, like a huge amount of stuff, and they just simply didn't look at it. You know, they sat on their hands, they didn't want to find out more, and then the cities burned the remains. So it's quite a scandal, and people get very angry at this point. There's an article from an academic called Götz Ali who accuses the university that they deliberately, semi-deliberately, or negligently failed to inform both the agencies involved and the public of the likely implications of the discovery.
What are the implications? What's he talking about?
Well, okay, so it's well known to the university itself. It was an infamous place. It was the Kaiser-Wilhelm-Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. And, you know, the sort of most alarming word there is the last one. And it's known that human remains, dead bodies of people, were sent back from the concentration camps to this institute.
So we think these bones came from there?
We don't know that. What we can say is these workers had stumbled across deliberately dug pits filled with human bones on a site that was known to have this connection.
And what did they do about it?
Well, they did nothing. So
I have not met anybody who thought that the cremation in 2014 was anything but a catastrophe and completely inappropriate. Maybe if you want to talk to the city coroner's office that made it happen. But other than that, everybody said, okay, this was whatever they found out was done very quickly, and it didn't, you know, there's no public report about it and so on. So that is, I think, relatively uncontroversial. Some people find it an absolute scandal. Other people say it shouldn't have happened, but it's gone. But there's no, I think, positive take on that.
But this was not one of those institutions or collections with ancestral human remains that we've been looking at this series so far, right?
Well, not exactly. I mean, in some ways, it was like them. It was actually in the possession of some of those other collections. But in the earlier episodes, we were talking about, you know, the building the collections of, for example, the Ethnological Museum. But this was a bit different. This was more like a medical research facility.
So, first of all, a museum it certainly was not, but we know that the Institute had large collections that came from different researchers who were there for different kinds of purposes. And we know that at least the first director of the Institute, Eugen Fischer, had done archaeological work before he came to Berlin.
This building, which is today on the grounds of the Free University, this was an institute established first in 1927.
And around that time, there's a movement, a commitment to progress and scientific advancement in Germany. Germany's known to be at the forefront of modern science in a lot of ways. There's institutes, even other Kaiser-Wilhelm institutes, that are filled with some of the most foremost scientists of the day. In 1917, the Kaiser-Wilhelm-Institute for Physics opens, led by none other than Albert Einstein. But this one, the Kaiser-Wilhelm-Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics, opens 10 years later in 1927.
The collections of human remains that we've spoken about in each of the previous episodes were all held in the S collection, or Schädelsammlung, which is a hoard of human skulls built up by a director of the Ethnological Museum called Felix von Luschan. That collection grew to be the largest such in the world, and it was prestigious enough that the Kaiser-Wilhelm Institute actually bought it up. But the truth is that at this new institute, they weren't interested in collecting skulls or measuring skulls. The science had moved on.
And like you said, the Kaiser-Wilhelm Institute was founded by Eugen Fischer. Can you tell us a little bit more? Who's Eugen Fischer?
Well, he's a professor of anatomy and anthropology, and he's one of the leading thinkers behind this new movement of what they called racial hygiene. He actually edits a magazine called Volk und Rasse, People and Race. And at this new institute, he's like a scientific administrator. So a lot of the time that he spends is trying to secure funding or deal with politicians to try and further the work of the institute.
What did you said he's not interested in skulls anymore? What did you mean by that?
Well, they want to go beyond skull measuring. He says it explicitly when he founds the institute. So they want to go beyond mere skull measuring. What he's interested in, well, is more like, how do genes actually work? How do they transmit their information? And he thinks he's found out.
I picked a picture, one of the many pictures you can find of him. I picked one here. We can put it up on Instagram. We could have chosen a picture of him doing the Nazi salute at one of these big rallies. He's often towards the front row. We could have chosen a picture of him sitting at his desk, looking at medical drawings or something. But instead, like, we want to explain this picture. We're looking at him in the field, but not in Germany.
No, he's in Namibia.
In Namibia, right? And that's important because he did research there. So I think this picture in particular is taken in 1908, which would be the last year of the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples. And it comes out of that context. In this picture, he's wearing a white jacket, and he's standing over one of those kind of old-fashioned cameras to photograph an African woman who's sitting there sort of below him with her baby.
Yeah, and the work he did in Namibia is important, not just because he was there while Germany was carrying out what's been described as the first genocide of the 20th century, but also because his work that he did there, the research he conducted, was influential. He wrote a paper about a mixed race group of people known as the Rehoboth bastards, or bastards. There are people living in Namibia, but this name, bastards, they specifically adopt it even today, and they get the name because they are mixed. You know, they're descended from both white settlers and native peoples.
The full title of Fischer's report from Namibia was The Rehoboth Bastards and the Problem of Miscegenation Among Humans. And that word miscegenation sort of tips us off to this whole thing that he's about when it comes to races. It means intermixing, interbreeding. So his thesis is quite clear. He says anytime a quote-unquote pure race comes into contact with a less pure race, the pure race will be degenerated.
Right, and there's a quote. He says, each European people that's assimilated the blood of inferior races has paid for this absorption of inferior elements by its intellectual, spiritual, and cultural decline.
Yeah, not only will mixing, as he says, interbreeding make you weaker, it will affect your culture, your intellect. And these ideas from Fischer, from Namibia, become really influential. Even Hitler mentions them in Mein Kampf. They go on to inform the Nuremberg laws, which outlaw intermarriage during the Nazi times. But what you want to point out is that he thinks he's proven something here, right? Fischer thinks this report on the Rehoboth bastards has proven Mendelian inheritance in humans. So, let's talk for a second about what is Mendelian inheritance. Is that this whole Peapods thing that I learned about in high school?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just the idea of inheritability. What do you inherit as you pass down your genes or whatever? So Mendel thought he found in Peapods how certain characteristics might skip a generation. You know, if you cross a small Peapod with a large Peapod, you don't get a middle-sized one, but rather some bigger ones, and then the next generation might have small ones. So it's just understanding the way that genes, what kind of traits are passed on through genes. But, you know, at Fischer's time, the idea of what traits might be associated with a certain gene are very broad. So, is there a gene for musical talent, or is there a gene for an aptitude for numbers? Or on the other side, is there a gene that would pass along a tendency for alcoholism or criminal behavior? And then, the idea of racial hygiene is to try and eliminate the negative genes. So, for example, if there's a gene for alcoholism, maybe you don't want to pass it on. And what these scientists are interested in is trying to sort of engineer a racially clean, genetically pure human being.
I mean, there's obviously something appealing in the simplicity of this logic, no?
Yeah, I think that nowadays we know that genes don't work like that. It isn't so simple. There isn't just one gene for one genetic trait in that way. There's an interaction. But, at this institute, they're trying to test this. So there are two areas where they think they can prove some of their hypotheses. And one area they think they can tell how genes transmit their information is through eye color. That's one of the first ways you might learn about this kind of thing. You see if one partner in a couple has blue eyes and the other has brown eyes, what color eyes do the children have? And how does that play out down the generations?
Yeah, eye color is definitely one. And the other area, let's say, where people like Eugen Fischer was particularly interested was twins and studying twins.
Yeah, again, it was like right in the sort of foundational research of what the institute was going to research. Twins, because they were, again, interested in how much of your physical makeup is determined by your genes and how much is it determined by your life experience or your environment. And so they thought that by examining twins was another place you might see that. Twins who might have, different characteristics, have different life experiences. They thought they could tell through a comparative analysis what exactly the genes were doing. And so, yes, exactly. There were two areas that this institute was very interested in were eyes and twins.
And because they're a prestigious institution, they have access to the population as research subjects. So they actually created a register of every known twin in Berlin, which is a bit dark when you think about where the Nazi state was going. And the idea of racial hygiene, which was promoted and developed at the KWI, were put into practice then, later, in the most violent and unethical way you can imagine. This is what sort of created the scientific basis for the sterilization and euthanasia programs that were carried out by the Nazi regime.
But in 1942, a new director takes over at the KWI, and he's got a close working relationship with one of his doctoral students. He publishes his writings and so on, and this student is a member of the SS named Joseph Mengele.
Mengele is a very famous figure in the Holocaust. He was the doctor at Auschwitz and showed up in memoirs and accounts of Auschwitz because he made the selection at the ramp.
Right, he would stand there as people were deboarding from the trains, and he would be advising, standing on the side and pointing either to the left or the right. And depending on that decision, people would be sent either to the crematorium or they would survive or, be sent to work.
He worked with the KWI.
Let's say they don't exactly announce his role or whatever, but there's some idea that maybe he had an office there. Certainly his name appeared on a roll of like birthdays of staff members. But there's a really shocking book, a first-hand report by a Hungarian doctor called Miklos Nyiszli about working for Mengele in Auschwitz. This Hungarian Jewish doctor was required to examine twins. Again, twins, because twins were very important to the KWI. So Mengele is carrying out his research also into twins. And he would examine them while they were alive. Then they would be murdered, and he would examine them immediately again after their death. He would then submit pathological reports from their autopsy.
Yeah, word got around in Auschwitz. They were looking for twins. And in his memoir, Nyiszli writes, mothers, hoping for special treatment for their twin children, readily gave them up to the scouts. Adult twins, knowing that they were of interest from a scientific point of view, voluntarily presented themselves in the hope of better treatment.
And, it was because of their interests in seeing how genes operated that they were so interested in twins. Incredibly dark as it sounds, Auschwitz was a kind of a huge medical opportunity for Mengele. He could perform research there that would never have been possible in normal times. And there's a quote where Nyiszli writes, An event never before experienced in the history of medicine worldwide is realized here. Twins die at the same time, and there is the possibility of subjecting their corpses to an autopsy. Where in normal life is there the case, bordering on a miracle, that twins die at the same place at the same time? A comparative autopsy is thus absolutely impossible under normal conditions, but in the Auschwitz camp there are several hundred pairs of twins, and their deaths in turn present several hundred opportunities.
Nyiszli's memoir is an important document because it explains that this human material, these harvested medical specimens from Auschwitz, were sent to Berlin.
In the memoir, Nyiszli specifically mentions Dahlem as the destination. And we know that there was a doctor in Berlin, a woman named Karin Magnussen, employed at the Institute, who was collaborating with Mengele.
Magnussen was working on eyes, right? Like, what's it called? With two different colored eyes.
Yeah, exactly. It was called heterochromia in eyes. And again, eyes were important because they were thought to display the inheritability that the Institute was interested in.
How did that work? Did she know what was happening in Auschwitz?
Yeah, I think she knew. As far as I understand it, she would request these medical specimens in a kind of euphemistic way. She would ask without acknowledging the implications of what she was asking for, but it was clear what it meant. She's asked about this after the war, and she says, "I asked Dr. Mengele, whenever the carriers of heterochromia should die, to send me the protocols of the autopsy and the eye material for examination. And each time she would ask, she would promptly be sent a large number of such samples. So I think it would have been impossible for her to be ignorant of the implications."
Yeah, it sounds like she knew what she was asking for.
Yeah, I mean, after the war, she tried to publish her research. I mean, she did publish some of it, and people understood that when she wrote, that she had conducted a study on 31 subjects from Central Europe, they understood that that meant she'd been taking and examining the body parts of concentration camp victims. And later, when she tried to publish further research, it was rejected because people knew you wouldn't have access to those samples without this crime.
And of course, as the Hungarian doctor Nyiszli was saying in his memoir, the medical space in Auschwitz was a place where people were being killed and then being used as the medical research subjects. But sometimes also people were killed because they presented like an interesting case.
Yeah, I mean, there's a horrible section in Nyiszli's memoir where he sees a father and son arrive, transported from, the Lismanstadt ghetto. And the father has a hunchback and the son has a deformed foot. And, there's no genetic relationship between those two things. They just happen to have them. But immediately, Mengele sees them as a good example for propaganda, a way to prove sort of the genetic deformation of the Jewish race. And so he has them killed, and he has Nyiszli perform an autopsy. There's a quote from the memoir where Nyiszli writes, "The cases were banal, but nevertheless, very easily they could be utilized as propaganda in support of the Third Reich theory concerning the degeneracy of the Jewish race." Late in the afternoon, having already sent at least 10,000 men to their death, Dr. Mengele arrived. He listened attentively to my report concerning both the in vivo, when they were alive, and post-mortem observations made on the two victims. "These bodies must not be cremated," he said. "They must be prepared, and their skeletons sent to the Anthropological Museum in Berlin."
In the end, the skeletons were wrapped in paper and sent to Berlin, labeled Urgent National Defense. Here, though, the Anthropological Museum in Berlin is mentioned. So are Jewish skeletons and Sinti Roma skeletons now being collected in museums like the other colonial remains that we've spoken about in this show?
Well, there were definitely people trying to do that. I mean, there's a letter from the professor of anatomy at Strasbourg University who writes to Himmler to request Jewish skulls for scientific research purposes. He says, voluminous collections of skulls exist of almost all races and peoples. Only in the case of the Jews does science have so few skulls at its disposal that no valid results can be arrived at from their study. The war in the East now affords us a chance to make up for this deficiency.
It does seem like a eerie parallel to the colonial remains stories that we've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same museums, the same institutions which house all the human remains we've spoken about in this series. 40 years earlier, the founder of this institute was conducting research in Namibia, where human remains from murdered prisoners were sent back to scientific collections in Berlin. Now human bodies are again being harvested as a resource, but from Jews and Sinti Roma people. And it's disturbing to consider this beside the collection of other artifacts of natural history. There's even a witness, a young girl, a twin, who survived Auschwitz, who remembered afterwards walking into Mengele's office, and as she did, she said she saw a vast collection of human eyes on the wall. She said there was a wall of blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes. These eyes were staring at me like a collection of butterflies. And I think that building is the director's villa. So I mean, it's a fancy part of town, and it was like an expensive, lavish institute, and also very modern in 1927. So when they built it, it was really at the kind of cutting edge of science, and they were getting all of this new equipment set up to conduct research.
We've walked around the block now, walking back up to the building, to the entrance again. There's a plaque here, like a bronze plaque on the side of the door.
This plaque is interesting because this was put here in 1987 by professors who did it without the permission of the university. They erected a plaque in order to try and get some recognition of what had happened here. I mean, the university didn't agree to it, but actually this plaque was then officially installed by the university a year later, but they've made a couple of slight amendments to it. So this one reads, do you want to read it?
It says, in this building from 1927 to 1945 was the Kaiser-Wilhelm-Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. The directors Eugen Fischer and Ottmar von Ferschauer and their collaborators provided scientific justifications for the inhumane racial and birth policies of the Nazi state. As instructors of SS doctors, they made an active contribution to selection and murder. The research on twins of Joseph Mengele in the Auschwitz concentration camp was planned in this building and supported by examinations and organs of selected and murdered prisoners. These crimes remain unpunished, and Ferschauer was professor of genetics until 1965. Scientists are responsible for the content and consequences of their scientific work.
In the original plaque set up by the scientists or the professors that worked here, there was a sentence which was omitted when the university installed it again, which was, after 1945, the perpetrators, with few exceptions, continued their scientific careers. Their research findings are still used by medical science today. The pits were discovered just around the other side near what today is the university library. Right, back to 2014. So those pits dug in the ground, they found 7 sacks of bones, which they took out and then 6 months later were burned in the municipal crematorium. Now what we do know is that those were taken for pits which were likely dug in 1945, right at the end of the war. So the whole history we've just heard, that's what the university is choosing to ignore. That's what they're choosing not to look at. And that's what causes the controversy.
Yeah, at that point, and so we're in 2015, the Free University assigns Susan Pollock, the archaeologist we've already heard from in this episode. And she brings, there's some other archaeologists involved as well, of course, and they look deeper. They're going to attempt to understand where these bones really came from.
So the first time we did that was to go back to this original site where the bones had been found in 2014. So, as you said already, 7 sacks. There were pictures that showed kind of how they were excavating, and it's not the way an archaeologist excavates, to say the least. So we said we want to go back and see if there are any remains still in the ground at that particular spot? And the answer was yes, there were quite a few bone fragments that we then recovered. And then then there was additional repair work done. We found somewhat more human bones. And so then we made the argument that in the summer of 2016, we wanted to open up the whole trench that had been made by the backhoe the first time and see whether there was anything else. And there was a lot.
That means they found more pits, right?
Actually, I think what they found is debris that may have already been disturbed. So either by the construction work in 2014, it could have scattered like some of the remains as they dug through it, or from earlier building projects. Anyway, this is when they turned up a huge number of bone fragments.
I like emphasize these are fragments. We have almost no complete bones, more than 16,000. And that doesn't count what they found in 2014 because we don't know how many there were. These bones were all fragmented. And when I say fragmented, some of them were as small as my small fingernail, some of them were, this long or whatever, and everything in between.
What you've got to remember is that these aren't the bones that they found in 2014, which were burned and which were maybe entire skeletons, skulls, and so on. These are tiny fragments, like bits of bones. I guess what we're all waiting to hear is whether in the end the bones that were found in the ground in Dahlem, the 16,000 bone fragments, really do come from the KWI, are connected to the KWI and the crimes it represents in Auschwitz.
Was there a connection to Auschwitz or was there a connection to the Kaiser-Wilhelm-Institute? The clear evidence that we had remains that had been sent to this institute from Auschwitz is not present as far as we could see. But on the other hand, these bones for sure came from the institute. And what you just described is the way that I tend to see this at this point. These were collections of human remains that were then discarded in pits in the ground. And where those collections came from to get to the Kaiser-Wilhelm-Institute is the question that we cannot directly address.
We can't address it because the KWI held multiple collections with different contexts, and there's no definitive archaeological or archival proof that the remains they found there belong to one and not the other. So the next step would be a sort of another kind of proof, like radiocarbon dating.
Yeah, but there was a decision made not to do radiocarbon dating to figure out when and where these bones came from, and the reason why they didn't want to do the radiocarbon dating is that it's invasive. You have to destroy a piece of the bone, but you also have to make a selection in order to know which fragments you're going to do the radiocarbon dating on, which is anyway complicated and not really representative necessarily.
The question was raised about whether it would be unethical to subject the remains of some of these victims to further research, destroying more of their bone, even if it might help to identify them. In a way, these remains have already been drilled into, dug into, have buildings put on top of them, smashed into pieces, scattered, dumped in pits in the ground. So you might think it's closing the gate after the horse has bolted.
In terms of what we excavated archaeologically, let me say, so the 16,000 fragments of human remains, the controversies go primarily, I think, around the question of whether or not it would have been appropriate to do invasive analyses, meaning genetic analysis or isotopic analysis or direct radiocarbon dating of human remains and so on, or whether what we did, which was kind of standard osteological analysis, looking at every fragment, trying to say, okay, what part of the body did it come from?
Right. And I would also say it's also 16,000. So it would be incredibly difficult to do it even just practically.
I think that's a good point in that you're not going to radiocarbon date all 16,000. So you're going to have to make a selection. So then it ends up being a bit random which you select. You is it a representative sample? We don't know.
Right.
This is a collection of stuff that's probably from different times.
But in the end, a decision was reached in consultation with different victim groups, or at least potential, who they thought would be the victim groups, right? We're talking about Jewish groups, Sinti Roma groups, and later also African groups because the S collection was held there. But so the decision was reached not to do the invasive research. Instead, they tried to understand what these remains were by looking at what lay around the remains. So, for example, they found animal bones from thousands of years ago, They found plastic tags and plaster casts of the kinds that were used in anthropological collections in the first part of the 20th century. But there was, like Susan Pollock told us, no smoking gun.
Right. One of the reasons there was no conclusive proof is because they'd already burned so much of the remains and we're having to rely only on these fragments. And because we can only take a small sample of them, they end up occupying a sort of strange status. They might be colonial remains, they might be from Auschwitz, they might be from thousands of years BC, which doesn't stop them being colonial because, as we know, the scientists who did that collection also went and stole from ancient burial grounds. They could be from anywhere.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we have to accept, though, that we'll probably never know where they come from. And like we said, there's too many to research. The communities don't want the invasive research to be done to them. Even if they did, it would be difficult to know which ones to do. But here's the thing. Susan Pollock says there's very likely more pits, more human remains still there under our feet in Berlin at the campus of the Free University.
I think the likelihood is pretty high. My guess is if one were to say, just excavate everything, which we're never going to do, that yes, one would find other human remains. And we know other places on what today is the campus of this university where human remains were found. So the university library building, which maybe you want to have a look on the website and see what it looks like, it's a huge tower. And the foundations, I have seen many pictures of it being built, the foundations were dug multiple meters deep. That means everything that was there is gone. And where it went, we don't know. I'm as confident as I can be that in doing that, they probably hit other pits with human bones. But as I said, that's simply gone.
When these bones first turned up, they were ignored and burned. That approach of shunning the evidence of these crimes has been a constant in our story, in Dig Where You Stand. But there has been a slower move toward recognition. And last year, in 2023, these fragments of bones were given a non-denominational burial in which all potential victim groups were invited, and the president of the university even made a sort of cautious admission of the crimes. Yeah, looking at the news agency video you can find online, people dressed soberly, strolling through a forested cemetery. A good number of boxes in which the fragments are held, I suppose. They're caskets, but yeah, the caskets are nice blonde wood being carried at the front of the procession in the cemetery you can see in the video. And we see images of the graves, and here's Gunther Ziegler, the president of the Freie University, the Free University. We simply have to see and feel that we are dealing with people, human beings, and that these people are victims, ultimately many victims of murder. And we simply have an obligation, even if it has been a long time, to give them peace. And even if we don't know the names, even if we can't classify them individually, they are victims. So what we heard right there was the president of the FU, the Freie University, admitting that the bodies found on campus were victims of a crime his university, under the previous president, didn't want to look into.
Yeah, and I think there has been a shift, not only at the FU, but in how all the institutions and museums across Germany have decided to deal with these ancestral human remains. I mean, in fact, Ilya Labachinsky, who we heard from episode 1, he works for the State Museums of Berlin, and he told us that in a way, there's a sort of repetition of history, but reversed, whereas, these same museums once sort of tried to outdo each other with the wealth and breadth of their collections of human remains and other materials. Now, often they're trying to compete with each other in order to give them back, to sort of show who's doing the best job of reckoning with their history.
Yeah, museums are almost competing with each other. And in doing that, there's this move toward trying, where possible, to do the provenance research, to identify the remains, and send them back to communities who are demanding their dead back.
Yeah, in the last few years, repatriations have been made to Hawaii in 2022, New Zealand in 2023. This year there was Palau, and Australia's likely next, I think, in 2025.
So looking at those restitutions, like you said, mostly to the Pacific, interestingly enough, we asked ourselves what made these restitutions successful, like positive events. They're collaborative somehow. Is there something we can learn from that?
I think that, on the whole, where these returns, when they have been possible, have been done with a sort of care and attention that does seem praiseworthy. It would be a good way to handle all of these returns, talk with the communities, engage them, and find a way to send the things back.
Herekieke, who you just heard singing, he was invited by the University of Göttingen, and there he performed the ceremony where he sang to his ancestors.
So I'm Te Herekieke Herawini. I'm the head of repatriation at the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papatonga Rewa, and I'm a native New Zealander, so my people are indigenous to New Zealand, and I come from a multiple of tribes from New Zealand. I've been working in the repatriation process since 2007. So every time I encounter our ancestors, our Māori and Moriori ancestors, the most important thing for us to do culturally is to acknowledge them and to greet them. To us, they are deeply sacred. The bridge between the physical and the sacred is provided by our traditional chants, our traditional singing, and our traditional greetings to the ancestors.
And yet, while we have this, let's say, laudable move toward caring, empathic returns, it's like so much needs to go right, like a perfect storm of money, goodwill, archival materials, and the institutions working together in order for these kinds of positive returns like this one to New Zealand.
Yeah, it does seem that the return of these remains are definitely more possible to countries that already have money and that have an infrastructure that's able to deal with them and that aren't, for example, appealing to make a trade deal or in negotiations to boost their economy in other ways. Often you'll see that the same imbalances which caused this stuff to be so easily looted in the first place to European museums and institutions continue to prevent its return.
We're bringing in the example of the New Zealand return because it's a model for how a restitution can go successfully. And to be fair, some steps have been taken. We've talked to people within institutions here in Berlin who've really expressed the desire and commitment to devote resources to this topic. And we've heard from a bunch of people that Germany is ahead of other European countries when it comes to restitutions and repatriations. And yet, the vast majority of these ancestral human remains are blocked from having that kind of treatment that we saw in New Zealand, even in this country, Germany, that's ahead. So what does that mean, actually, that most of the remains held here are denied that kind of dignified treatment?
For as long as these ancestral remains are kept in the basements and archives of these museums, they act as bodily evidence of the murder and exploitation which is the foundational act of these scientific institutions. And the best resolution would be for them all to be granted the same care and attention which were afforded to the remains in the returns in New Zealand. And yet, if one of the ways which these museums are going to show how enlightened they are is to compete against each other to make these returns, well, that's still a complicated idea. If Berlin wants to show it's more advanced than Paris or London by making a display of its treatment of a small portion of its collection of human remains, well, then it turns them into a political symbol for the opposite reason that they were taken in the first place. Rather than standing for Germany's scientific advancement or its military power, they now represent its enlightened reckoning with its own history. But in each case, the victims are having the meaning of their own bodies determined from the outside.
So what's the resolution then?
Well, I suppose one way of ending is just to say that it isn't over. I mean, there are still people who can identify their direct ancestors. There are still bodies being held in the museums.
I think to the question of what does it mean that the ancestral remains still exist in the archives here in Berlin and in other cities, I mean, what are the principles that we're okay with defining our society by? Is it okay that they're in our basements? Is it something as a society that, we're okay with saying, yeah, we're the kind of society that holds on to human skulls in basements and archives because it's difficult to deal with them? What does that say about our values?
I think that's a good point. And, there's an official document called the Recommendations for the Care of Human Remains in Museums and Collections. And it was put together by a working group. And it's been subscribed to by Berlin and a lot of the major museums. But ultimately, the conclusion of it ends up being, you might have to keep them, but the main thing is don't show them out of respect. And I think that there's a question to that. Is that the best thing? is the most dignified thing we can come up with to keep these remains in the basement and not show them. And I feel like that's the same logic which got the Freie Universität to say for those first 6 months when they discovered these things under the ground, well, let's not think about that. And then they were sent to the crematorium.
But we should say that while the struggle for a complete reckoning with this subject continues, victories are being won along the way. Recently, we attended an event in which Nyaka Sururu Mboro, who began our series with the story of his search for the head of Mengele, was finally able to have a street renamed in Berlin. It was a fight he'd been taking on for more than 30 years. And on a very hot Friday, August afternoon, Peter, you and I went to the ceremony in Wedding in the Africa Quarter here in Berlin to witness the official renaming of Peters Allee. Peters Allee was named after Karl Peters, the Bloody Hand.
Right, and I think that was a great symbolic moment because Peters Allee was, it had been named after this brutal colonial mass murderer in Tanzania, and now it was given two names. One section of it was called Anna Munkunda Allee, named for an anti-apartheid fighter from Namibia, and the other half is now called Maji Maji Allee, named for the resistance struggle in Tanzania. And it was a very impressive moment. Both Mboro and Israel Herekieke gave speeches. That was Dig Where You Stand Season 1. Thanks very much for listening.
This episode was produced by me, Benjamin Stoller, Peter Matthews, and Rowan Ben Jackson. Music by Lawrence Van Oswald. Mix and sound by Rowan Ben Jackson.
We hope to keep the feed alive in the coming weeks and months with interviews with people whose work we found helpful or interesting with relation to the subject. But that's the end of the official Season 1, and hopefully we'll be back sometime next year with Season 2.
Yeah, you can email us at info@colomedia.com or write to us on Instagram at Dig Where You Stand Show. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks very much.